San Francisco always looked cleanest from a distance, glass towers catching late light, the bay a sheet of dull silver beyond them. Up close, it was fingerprints on elevator buttons, coffee rings on conference tables, and badges that opened doors but never opened conversations. Evelyn Cole stood in the lobby of TideLink Systems with an empty cardboard box cradled against her ribs. It was the kind of box companies pretended was thoughtful, just large enough for a mug, a framed photo, and whatever small proof a person had ever been there. Her laptop was gone. Her access had been shut off before she reached the elevator bank. Her name would disappear from Slack within the hour. She had resigned 10 minutes ago, and the decision still rang in her ears with a steady, unreal clarity. Not because she was impulsive. Evelyn wasn't built that way. She had been trained by student loans, by rent that climbed every year, by the quiet threat of layoffs in tech, to swallow discomfort and keep moving. She had learned to smooth her voice in meetings, to hold back when she was certain, to offer her solutions as suggestions so they would land softly. She had learned the strange professional art of being essential while making yourself look replaceable. But there was a limit to how many times she could be asked to carry a failure that wasn't hers. 2 nights ago, a deployment had gone wrong. The company's flagship product, an autonomous logistics platform used by dozens of regional carriers, had stalled across multiple clients. Routes froze. Warehouses backed up. A few $1 million worth of chaos stacked itself into the morning. By lunchtime, an incident report had been published internally, clean and confident, with one sentence that turned Evelyn's stomach. Root cause: a critical parsing bug introduced in a recent commit by Cole. They had attached the commit hash. They had attached her name. They had attached her as if she were a label. She could have accepted it, the way she'd accepted other things. An idea borrowed without credit, a promotion that slipped from her hands into someone else's, the lingering suspicion that she was always one misstep away from being not a culture fit. Instead, she had done what she always did when something didn't make sense. She had checked the logs. At first, she only wanted to defend herself. A bug was a solvable thing. A timeline was a map. She opened the pipeline history. She compared build artifacts. She traced the failure back through the service mesh. She pulled the audit trail that most people didn't bother with because it required an extra permission and an extra 10 minutes. She found the quiet edit, small enough to look accidental, precise enough to be lethal, a configuration override, a single line that rerouted requests under load, a change that wouldn't be caught by standard tests because it only triggered in production conditions. It wasn't her commit. It had been injected after her code was merged, under a service account that belonged to the platform team. And the platform team belonged to the people who lived 2 floors above her, behind glass doors that required a different badge. Evelyn printed the logs anyway, even though no one printed anything anymore. Paper felt like gravity. She took the evidence to her manager first, then to compliance, then to HR when compliance redirected her with polite speed. She was passed from meeting to meeting like an inconvenient file. In the final conference room, a director she'd barely spoken to sat with his hands folded, wearing the kind of calm that came from knowing his job was safe. He thanked her for her thoroughness. He told her investigations were complex. He said the company valued her. He said they were taking steps. Then he asked her, very gently, if she would be willing to sign an updated incident statement for the sake of closure. It wasn't an order, not technically. It wasn't a threat, not in words. But the message was clear enough that Evelyn could feel it like a hand at her back. Take the fall quietly. Let the story settle. Keep your reputation intact. By accepting the version they were willing to allow. She didn't sign. She stood up, placed the printed logs on the table, and told him she was leaving. For a second, the room went very still, as if her refusal had broken some unwritten law. Then the director nodded and said he understood, as if she had asked for an extra day of PTO. Evelyn walked out with her badge still clipped to her belt, her hands steady, her face neutral. She kept her pace measured all the way to the lobby because she had learned that panic made other people comfortable. Only now, standing beneath a wall of polished stone and an art installation no one ever looked at, did she feel the tremor under her skin. The security guard behind the desk glanced up with mild interest. He didn't ask questions. He had seen enough exits to know they weren't his business. Evelyn shifted the box in her arms. Her left hand came up to touch the badge, more from habit than intention. It was already deactivated. The little light that used to blink green stayed dark. She should have gone home. She should have called someone. Her mother, maybe. Or the one friend she trusted not to turn it into a lecture. She should have taken the Muni, let the city blur, let her body catch up to her choice. Instead, she found herself facing the elevator bank. A row of brushed steel doors, a mirrored panel that reflected her back at her. Dark hair pulled into a low knot, a tired face that looked older than 28, a posture arranged into competence. She didn't look like a person who had just detonated her own life. She looked like a person still waiting for someone to tell her she'd done the right thing. The call button glowed when she pressed it. For a second, she watched her fingertip, pale against the circle of light. It was a small, stupid detail to focus on, but her mind needed something concrete. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The doors slid open. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented. Industrial cleanliness. The floor was spotless. A camera sat in the corner like a quiet witness. Evelyn stepped in, her reflection multiplied in the mirrored walls. She looked down at the panel and hesitated, then pressed the button for the parking level. She still had her car downstairs. She still had a lease to pay and groceries to buy, and an existence that did not pause for moral victories. The doors closed. The elevator began to descend. At first, everything felt normal. The gentle pull in her stomach, the slight shift in her ears, the hum that built and settled. Then the hum changed. It deepened, as if something inside the shaft had caught. The lights flickered. Once, twice, like a bad connection. The elevator shuddered with a sudden small violence. Evelyn's box slid in her arms. She tightened, her grip, heart kicking once against her ribs. It stopped. Not with the soft precision of a programmed halt, but with a hard finality, as if the elevator had hit a decision point and chosen wrong. The lights blinked out. Darkness pressed in. For a beat, there was no sound except Evelyn's breathing and the distant pulse of her own blood. She could smell cardboard, her own perfume, the faint metallic scent of machine oil. She reached for her phone. The screen lit her hand in cold blue. No signal. Of course. Evelyn exhaled slowly and forced her mind to do what it always did. Organize. Stay calm. Press the emergency button. Call security. Wait. Her thumb moved toward the panel. The elevator dropped. Not a full free fall. Just enough to steal air from her lungs. The motion was a sudden downward lurch followed by a jolting catch, like a body stumbling on stairs. The box slammed into her chest. Something inside it cracked. Ceramic, probably. A mug. A clean sound that felt absurdly final. Evelyn's phone flew from her hand and clattered against the wall. The screen went dark. She braced herself, knees bent, palm against the mirror, fighting the instinct to scream. The darkness was complete now. It wasn't the darkness of a closed room. It was the darkness of being sealed inside machinery. The elevator shuddered again. The cables, or whatever held it, groaned in a low, straining complaint. Evelyn thought with strange clarity, this is how people die. Not with a dramatic moment, but with a mechanical failure, and no one watching. Her mind reached for a memory that didn't belong here. A different elevator, a different day. a different version of herself walking into a future she couldn't see. Then the pressure in her ears changed, sharp and painful, as if the air itself had been sucked away. For a moment she couldn't tell whether she was moving or still. The darkness felt like water, a sound like tearing, somewhere deep in the shaft. A jolt. And then, nothing. No falling, no humming, no lights, no breath. Only a sudden, complete silence, so total it felt like the world had been unplugged. Evelyn didn't have time to form a prayer. She didn't have time to think of her mother or the rent or the unfinished code she'd left behind. Her last conscious thought was not fear. It was anger. Not at the elevator, not at the company, at herself. At every time she had watched her life become narrower and told herself it was normal. Light returned in a way that made no sense, not the harsh white of fluorescent tubes, but a thin morning brightness, filtered through cheap blinds. Dust hung in it, visible like tiny planets. The air smelled of laundry detergent and instant coffee. Evelyn blinked. Her eyelids felt heavy. Her lashes stuck together briefly, as if she had been crying or sleeping too long. She lay on a bed that was too small, the mattress uneven, the sheet familiar, in a way that made her stomach turn. The room around her was wrong. Not wrong. Like an unfamiliar hotel room. Wrong like the past. A dresser with scuffed corners, posters taped to the wall, a stack of textbooks with worn spines, a cheap desk lamp with a crack in the base, a plastic alarm clock that displayed the time in bright red numbers, 6:12 a.m. Evelyn sat up so fast her head spun. Her body moved differently, lighter, less stiff. No ache in her lower back from too many hours at a desk. No tightness in her wrists from typing. Her hands came into view on the blanket. They were her hands, but not the ones she had woken up with yesterday. The skin was smoother, the veins less visible. The faint scar near her thumb, earned at 22 in a kitchen accident, was gone. Her breath hitched. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet landed on cold linoleum. The floor was the same cheap pattern she remembered from childhood, a faded tile that tried to look like stone. Across the room, a mirror hung on the closet door, held there by two mismatched hooks. Evelyn stood on instinct and crossed to it. The girl in the mirror stared back at her. Same dark hair, but longer, falling past her shoulders in a messy wave. Same eyes, but brighter, less guarded. Same face, but softened by youth, by unspent years. 18, maybe 19 at most. Evelyn's mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no sound came out. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She looked away from the mirror, scanning the room for any sign that she was dreaming. Her gaze landed on a corkboard above the desk. It was cluttered with old receipts, a handwritten schedule, and a single printed paper pinned near the top. A flyer from the community college. Orientation date circled in ink. Below it, in her own handwriting, sharp and certain, were two words: "Don't waste." Evelyn stared at the words until her vision blurred. A laugh tried to rise and turned into something else, something sharp and close to a sob. She pressed her palm to the desk to steady herself. From somewhere in the apartment, a familiar sound drifted down the hall, pots clinking, a cabinet shutting, a radio turned low. A voice followed it, tired but steady. Her mother's voice. Evelyn's throat tightened. She hadn't heard that voice without a phone between them in years. Not in the mornings. Not when the day was still full of possibility. She took one step toward the door, then stopped, suddenly afraid that if she opened it, the illusion would break. That she would wake up back in the dark elevator, lungs screaming, hands clutching a box of broken things. She looked down at herself again. She was wearing an old t-shirt and shorts she recognized. On her wrist was a cheap elastic band she used to wear in high school. On the desk, next to the lamp, lay a smartphone, an older model, scratched at the edges. Evelyn picked it up with trembling fingers and pressed the side button. The screen lit. The date glowed at the top. Friday, August 12th, 2016. Her mind tried to reject it. It searched for explanations. Coma, hallucination, brain trauma. It reached for logic the way it always did. But the room held steady. The smell of coffee was real. The sounds of morning were real. Her mother was real. Evelyn lowered the phone slowly, as if it might explode. She stood in the center of her childhood bedroom, wrapped in silence, and felt something settle inside her. Not comfort, not joy, not even relief. A decision. She didn't ask why this had happened. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because the why could come later, if it came at all. What mattered was the fact of it. She was here. And she knew exactly what waited if she let life unfold the way it had before. Evelyn pressed her fingers to her pulse at her wrist, feeling the fast, living beat. She took a long breath through her nose, held it, then let it out slowly. The fear didn't leave. The confusion didn't leave. But beneath them, something harder took shape, something that had been growing in her for years and had finally reached its limit. Resolve. Evelyn turned toward the door. In the hallway, her mother hummed under her breath, the melody half forgotten, half made up. The sound pulled Evelyn forward like a thread. She placed her hand on the doorknob. It was cool under her palm. This time, she told herself, she would not make the same choices. This time, she would not hand her life over to people who wrote her name on their mistakes. This time, she would not waste it again. Morning arrived the way it always had in that apartment, quietly, without ceremony, as if the day had no idea what it was about to carry. Evelyn moved through it with careful precision. She showered, dressed, and tied her hair back the same way she had in high school, though the gesture felt foreign now. The mirror reflected a younger version of herself wearing familiar clothes, but the eyes looking back no longer belonged to a teenager waiting for life to happen. They belonged to someone who had already watched it go wrong. In the kitchen, her mother stood at the counter, measuring coffee grounds with an old plastic scoop. The radio murmured about traffic and weather. Nothing had changed here. The same chipped mug. The same calendar pinned crookedly to the wall. The same quiet effort to keep everything together. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe and watched for a moment, feeling the weight of what she knew press against the simplicity of the scene. This was the first place. Everything had cracked. Her father would be home late tonight. He had been restless then, unhappy at work, eager for something better, something faster. In the old timeline, that restlessness had been fed by a neighbor's tip, a sure thing whispered over a fence and reinforced by online forums that made risk feel communal. A leveraged investment, a short-term return, a promise that sounded smarter the more often it was repeated. They had lost nearly everything within a year. Evelyn had been 18 when it happened. She remembered the tension settling into the apartment like dust. The argument spoken quietly at first, then not at all. The way her father's shoulders had begun to slope forward, as if gravity had found him personally offensive. The way her mother had taken on extra shifts without ever saying the word fear. That loss had set the tone for everything that followed. Her decision to drop out of school, her rush into stability, her willingness to accept less, because less felt safer than nothing. Evelyn stepped into the kitchen. Her mother looked up and smiled, the same small, tired smile she had always worn in the mornings. It struck Evelyn with unexpected force how young her mother still was here, how much time remained unspent. They spoke about ordinary things: breakfast, the weather, whether the bus pass was still in her backpack. Evelyn answered carefully, measuring her voice, keeping it light. She didn't trust herself not to give something away. The moment came after her mother left for work. Evelyn's father arrived home earlier than expected, jacket slung over one arm, energy buzzing beneath his movements. He talked as he crossed the room, words tumbling quickly, the way they did when he was excited about an idea. He mentioned a coworker, a lead, a possibility. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her heart slowing instead of racing. She had expected fear to rise. Instead, she felt clarity. When she spoke, she did so without urgency. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She didn't say, "This will ruin us," though the memory burned in her chest. She asked questions. Where had the information come from? What guarantees were there? Why was the return so high if the risk was low? What would happen if the timing was wrong? She pulled up articles on her phone, calmly, methodically. Not sensational warnings, but measured analyses, regulatory fines, case studies, the quiet language of probability instead of promise. Her father frowned. Then he paused. Then he listened. Evelyn watched something subtle shift in him, not certainty, but doubt. Doubt had not existed the first time around. Doubt was enough. By the time the conversation ended, nothing had been decided, but nothing had been committed either. The investment remained hypothetical, its momentum stalled. Evelyn exhaled only after he left the room. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was a correction. The second correction came more quietly. Ethan. Walker texted her that afternoon. His name on the screen stirred a familiar mixture of comfort and restraint. Ethan had always been steady, the kind of person adults trusted instinctively. He was kind without being curious, confident without being ambitious. In the old timeline, he had represented a future that looked safe from the outside, a shared apartment, predictable income, a life that didn't ask too much. Evelyn had chosen him because choosing him felt like choosing rest. Now, holding the phone in her hand, she saw the cost of that choice with painful clarity. She remembered the dinners where she explained her ideas, only to watch his attention drift. The way he'd praised her when she compromised, not when she pushed. The subtle pressure to be reasonable, to want what he wanted, to stop reaching for things that complicated their plans. Ethan hadn't destroyed her life. He hadn't meant to limit her, but he hadn't made space for her to grow either. Evelyn typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on one that was brief and honest without being cruel. She didn't explain everything. She didn't need to. She told him she was focusing on school, that she needed time, that she couldn't promise the version of stability he was offering. She sent the message before she could second-guess herself. The phone remained silent afterward. No argument, no pleading, just absence. Evelyn set it down and let the quiet sit. That, too, was a correction. The third correction required paperwork. Community college registration wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with banners or welcome kits or proud announcements. It came with online forms, placement tests, and advisors who spoke in careful tones designed to manage disappointment. Evelyn filled everything out with deliberate attention. She chose her courses with a clarity she hadn't possessed at 18 the first time. Math, computer science fundamentals, logic. No filler. No vague. Electives chosen because they sounded manageable. When the confirmation email arrived, she stared at it longer than she expected. This was not the path she had once dreamed of, but it was the path that worked. She remembered the shame she had felt before. Enrolling here after watching classmates move on to 4-year universities. She remembered telling herself it was temporary, that she would catch up later, that it didn't matter. It had mattered. This time, she felt none of that. This time, she understood that momentum was not about speed. It was about direction. By the end of the week, Evelyn had made 3 choices that diverged sharply from the life she remembered. Each one felt small in isolation. Together, they shifted the ground beneath her feet. What unsettled her was not how difficult it was, but how easy. As if the life she had lived before had been built on habits rather than fate. Still, one question lingered. If she was here because of something extraordinary, if time itself had bent, could she use that knowledge to get ahead? The thought crept in late at night, unwelcome but persistent. She knew things: market crashes, corporate scandals, companies that would soar and companies that would vanish. She remembered headlines. She remembered numbers. The temptation was quiet but sharp. Evelyn opened her laptop and began searching. She cross-referenced dates, stock tickers, product launches. She created a small spreadsheet, careful not to rush, tracking companies she knew would spike within the next few years. The results were disappointing. Some data didn't exist yet. Other timelines were off by months. In one case, a merger she remembered clearly hadn't even been announced in this version of events. The more she dug, the more unstable her certainty became. Memory, she realized, was not a clean archive. It was impressionistic, shaped by emotion and distance. She remembered outcomes, not mechanisms. She remembered that something happened, not exactly when or why. Even when she tried to act on what she knew, buying a small amount of stock with the little money she had saved, the return was underwhelming. A modest gain. Nothing transformative. The future resisted being mined. Evelyn closed the spreadsheet and leaned back in her chair. This was not a shortcut. It was an opportunity, one that still required work. She smiled faintly at the realization. There was relief in it. If success couldn't be stolen, it would have to be built. And that, at least, was something she knew how to do. Orientation day arrived with unremarkable weather and fluorescent lighting. The community college auditorium filled slowly, students clustering in uncertain groups. Some looked eager, others looked bored. A few wore the expression Evelyn recognized too well, people who had arrived here not because they chose it, but because everything else had slipped away. She took a seat near the aisle and listened as administrators spoke about the resources, transfers, and opportunity. The words were practiced. Still, she heard truth in them now. After the general session, students were directed towards smaller departmental orientations. Evelyn followed the signs for computer science. The room was smaller, the chairs arranged without ceremony. A handful of faculty members stood at the front, discussing course tracks and expectations. Evelyn took notes out of habit, even when the information was familiar. Then the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle, just a slight reorientation of attention. A pause in the rhythm of the presentation. Evelyn looked up. A man stood near the side of the room, speaking quietly with one of the professors. He wasn't dressed like the faculty. No blazer, no attempt at authority. His clothes were simple, practical. His posture was relaxed but attentive, as if he were more comfortable listening than performing. He turned slightly, and Evelyn saw his face. The recognition was immediate and visceral. Adrian Lynn. The name surfaced with everything attached to it. Late-night meetings, precise critiques, an expression that never softened even when he approved of something. In her old life, he had been several layers above her in the hierarchy. A technical lead, whose standards were unforgiving and whose trust was rare. He had never been unkind. He had also never been warm. Seeing him here, younger and out of place, sent a shock through her system. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not yet. Not like this. Evelyn's mind raced to catch up. Visiting researcher, she realized. University lab. Temporary affiliation. Time had shifted, but not everything had moved with it. Adrian spoke briefly when introduced. Something about autonomous systems research. about collaboration between institutions. His voice was the same, calm, measured, efficient. Evelyn watched him the way she once watched systems under load, looking for stress points, for signs of instability. There were none. He glanced across the room as he finished speaking. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met hers. The moment held, stretched thin by recognition that ran only one way. Adrian's gaze passed over her without pause, without interest. She was just another student, another face. Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This, too, was information. Whatever this second chance was, it did not revolve around him. Not yet. Not automatically. She would not be seen because of what she remembered. She would have to be seen because of what she did. As the session ended and students began to file out, Evelyn gathered her things with deliberate calm. She did not rush. She did not look back. She stepped into the hallway, the noise rising around her, and felt the strange alignment of fear and certainty settle into place. The first corrections had been made. The rest would take time. And time, for once, was on her side. The lab did not look the way Evelyn had imagined it. In her memory, research labs were sleek spaces, glass walls, glowing screens, people speaking in low, confident voices while machines hummed with purpose. That image had come mostly from marketing videos and grant proposals, not reality. The Autonomous Systems Lab occupied the third floor of an older engineering building whose hallways smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. The lights were too bright. The carpet had been replaced with industrial flooring that showed every scuff. Whiteboards lined the walls, crowded with half-erased equations and diagrams layered on top of one another like sediment. It was, Evelyn realized with a quiet satisfaction, exactly the kind of place where real work happened. She stood just inside the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, watching the room orient itself around her presence. No one looked up for more than a second. Conversations continued. Fingers kept moving across keyboards. The lab did not pause to evaluate whether she belonged. That, too, was familiar. A graduate assistant handed her a visitor badge and pointed her toward an empty desk near the back, next to a rolling cart stacked with spare parts. Evelyn thanked him and set her things down without comment. She had applied to the lab 3 days after orientation, attaching a short statement of interest and a resume that looked unimpressive on paper. No internships, no research publications, just coursework, part-time jobs, and a brief note about wanting to focus on systems-level understanding rather than surface applications. She had expected to wait weeks for a response. Instead, she'd received a single-line email from the lab coordinator that morning. "Come by this afternoon. We'll see what you can do." Now she was here. Victor Hale noticed her about 10 minutes later. He was hard to miss, not because he was loud, but because he carried himself as if the room were already his. Early 40s, neat, haircut, the faint impatience of someone who had once been promising and now resented having to prove himself again and again. He scanned Evelyn from the doorway of his office with professional efficiency. "You're the new student," he said, already turning away. It wasn't a question. Evelyn nodded. "Yes." Victor gestured toward the cart beside her desk. "We need that inventory sorted. Components labeled, outdated parts flagged. Once that's done, clean up the simulation logs on Station 7. The last batch was a mess." He did not ask what she knew. He did not ask what she wanted to work on. He handed her a task list that looked suspiciously like maintenance. Evelyn took it without protest. She had learned long ago that the fastest way to be underestimated was to look eager for something else. She spent the next several hours cataloging sensors, wiping down workstations, and organizing files no one had touched in months. The tasks were simple but time-consuming, designed to occupy rather than challenge. As she worked, she listened. The lab spoke in fragments, arguments about edge cases, quick bursts of frustration, the hum of simulations restarting after failure. Evelyn absorbed the rhythm, the language, the unspoken hierarchy. Victor dominated the flow, assigning tasks, reviewing outputs, correcting tone more often than content. Adrian Lynn sat at a workstation near the center of the room. Evelyn knew his presence before she consciously acknowledged it. Some habits of awareness never disappeared. Adrian worked quietly, headphones looped around his neck rather than over his ears, his attention divided between a terminal window and a notebook filled with tightly written notes. He did not look at her, not once. Evelyn felt the absence like pressure. In the old timeline, Adrian's attention had been something she'd learned to anticipate. A sudden question during a review, a precise critique delivered without preamble. She had spent years trying to earn a nod that meant approval rather than tolerance. Now, she was invisible to him. The realization should have unsettled her. Instead, it sharpened her focus. By late afternoon, Evelyn reached the second item on Victor's list, cleaning up simulation logs on Station 7. The station was older, its monitor flickering slightly at the edges. She pulled up the latest run data and began scrolling. At first, it looked like exactly what Victor had said. A mess. Inconsistent outputs. Dropped packets. Minor anomalies that suggested either noise or human error. Evelyn frowned. Noise followed patterns. Human error left fingerprints. She opened a deeper diagnostic view and overlaid the results from the last 3 simulation runs. The discrepancies aligned in a way that made her pause. She leaned closer to the screen. The issue wasn't random, it was systemic. The autonomous navigation model was overcorrecting under specific edge conditions, tight turns combined with sensory latency. The system compensated too aggressively, creating oscillations that compounded rather than resolved. It was subtle, the kind of flaw that wouldn't trigger immediate alarms but would degrade performance over time. The kind that could pass basic testing and still fail catastrophically in the real world. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could flag it and move on. That was, technically, her assignment. The problem wasn't hers to fix. She was not authorized. She was not expected to do more than tidy up. But she knew what happened when small flaws were ignored. She checked the version control. The relevant module was accessible, though protected. She didn't push changes. She duplicated the environment and began working locally, adjusting parameters, running controlled tests. Minutes turned into an hour. She forgot about the rest of the lab, forgot about Victor, forgot about Adrian. The model responded to her changes almost immediately. Oscillations dampened. Path predictions stabilized. Performance metrics improved by a narrow but meaningful margin. Evelyn sat back slowly, heart pounding. She hadn't fixed everything, but she had found the root. She documented the changes carefully, annotating each adjustment with clear reasoning. She saved the results, then hesitated. This was the moment where the old Evelyn would have stopped. She didn't. She compiled her findings into a brief report and sent it. Not to Victor, but to the lab's general review channel, tagging Dr. Thomas Reed. Then she returned the workstation to its original state, erased her local changes, and logged out. If she was wrong, she would be corrected. If she was right, someone would notice. Dr. Reed noticed the next morning. Evelyn was restocking cables when she heard her name spoken aloud, clearly and without irritation. She turned to see a man in his late 50s standing near Station 7, glasses perched low on his nose, his attention fixed on the screen. "Did you run this analysis?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, sir." Dr. Reed gestured for her to come closer. "Walk me through it." She did. She explained the oscillation pattern, the conditions under which it emerged, the reasoning behind her adjustments. She spoke evenly, without apology or embellishment. When she wasn't sure about something, she said so. Dr. Reed listened without interrupting. Victor approached halfway through, his expression tightening as he realized what was happening. He opened his mouth once, then closed it. When Evelyn finished, Dr. Reed straightened. "This issue's been bothering us for weeks," he said. "We assumed it was sensor noise." "It isn't," Evelyn replied. "Not primarily." Dr. Reed smiled faintly. "No, it isn't." He turned to Victor. "Why wasn't this flagged earlier?" Victor's jaw set. The logs were inconsistent. It didn't seem like a priority. Dr. Reed finished for him. He turned back to Evelyn. "You have good instincts." Evelyn felt heat rise behind her eyes, sharp and unwelcome. She blinked it away. Dr. Reed nodded toward the workstation. "From now on, I want you assisting with system diagnostics, less inventory work." Victor said nothing. Dr. Reed moved on, already pulling up another dataset. Evelyn returned to her desk, her hands steady, her breathing controlled. She didn't look at Victor. She didn't look at Adrian. She didn't need to. Adrian had noticed. Not when Evelyn first arrived. Not when Victor assigned her menial tasks. He had seen that pattern too many times to find it interesting. He noticed when the simulation results changed. It was a small shift. Barely perceptible unless you were watching closely. Adrian was always watching closely. He replayed the run twice, then pulled up the previous data. His brow furrowed. The improvement wasn't dramatic, but it was clean. Intentional. He scanned the commit history. No official changes. His gaze moved finally to the back of the lab. Evelyn sat at her desk, focused, unaware of him. She looked like any other student. Quiet, unassuming, easy to overlook. Adrian frowned. He remembered her name from the orientation list. A first year. Community college transfer track. Not who he would have expected. He didn't approach her. He didn't ask questions. He filed the observation away the way he did everything else that mattered. But something in his internal map shifted. That evening, as the lab emptied and the building settled into quiet, Adrian paused by Evelyn's workstation on his way out. She was packing up, movements efficient, careful. He glanced at the screen she'd left open. Notes from her analysis, neatly organized. Adrian nodded once, to himself. It wasn't acknowledgement, not yet, but it was the beginning of recalibration. Evelyn slung her backpack over her shoulder and headed for the door, unaware of the change she'd triggered. She stepped into the hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing softly, and felt the weight of the day settle into something solid. She hadn't asked for recognition. She had earned it. And somewhere behind her, the lab had begun, quietly, to adjust around her. Time in the lab began to stretch. Days blurred into evenings, evenings into nights. The Autonomous Systems Lab took on a different character after sunset. Quieter, more focused, stripped of performance. The overhead lights dimmed automatically after 10. The city outside the windows became a scatter of distant gold and red, traffic flowing like a living circuit. Evelyn found herself staying later than she ever planned, not because she was asked to, not because she was trying to prove anything. The work simply demanded it. Systems did not reveal their weaknesses on schedule. Bugs waited patiently, surfacing only when attention slipped. Adrian was often there too. They did not plan it. Their schedules aligned without discussion, as if drawn by the same gravitational field. Sometimes Evelyn arrived to find him already seated at the central workstation, sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on cascading lines of code. Other nights, Adrian walked in while she was deep in a diagnostic trace, barely registering his presence until his shadow crossed the desk. They spoke rarely at first. When they did, it was about the work. A misbehaving sensor fusion module, an edge case no one had modeled. a disagreement about whether stability should be prioritized over responsiveness in high-speed conditions. Their conversations were precise, stripped of politeness, sharpened by mutual competence. They argued without raising their voices. Evelyn learned quickly that Adrian did not waste words. Every sentence carried intent. Every question was a test, not of obedience, but of understanding. He challenged assumptions, including his own, and expected others to do the same. She did. That was new. In her previous life, Evelyn had learned how to survive meetings by shrinking, by choosing phrasing that softened her certainty, by letting others take credit if it meant avoiding conflict. This time, she didn't. When she disagreed with Adrian, she said so plainly. When she didn't know something, she admitted it without apology. When she was right, she didn't step aside to make room for someone else's ego. Adrian noticed. Not in any visible way. He didn't praise her. He didn't offer reassurance. But his questions became more direct. His attention lingered longer on her explanations. He began assigning her problems that didn't come with obvious solutions. They debugged together late into the night, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the same screen, each tracking a different layer of the system. Sometimes hours passed without a word spoken. Sometimes they filled the silence with diagrams, equations, and quiet corrections scribbled onto the same whiteboard. There was no touching. No accidental brushing of hands. No lingering glances that crossed into something personal. Their proximity was practical, not intimate. If either of them noticed the way the air seemed to tighten when they worked closely, neither acknowledged it. They were, Evelyn thought, running on parallel lines. Close, aligned, never intersecting. Outside the lab, life continued. Evelyn attended classes during the day, worked part-time shifts to cover expenses, and returned to the small apartment she shared with her family. She slept lightly, her mind replaying systems and scenarios even in dreams. She avoided Ethan Walker with practiced efficiency, declining invitations with polite finality. Adrian remained a fixed point, present in her evenings, absent from her personal life. That boundary held until it didn't. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was addressed to Adrian, copied to Dr. Reed and Victor, marked confidential. Evelyn saw it only because Victor printed it and left it on the conference table, assuming no one else would be in the room. She didn't mean to read it, but the subject line caught her eye. Offer. Advanced Autonomous Mobility Division, Berlin. Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest. She read just enough to understand. A major, European automotive group. Significant funding. Full access to proprietary datasets. A leadership role in a flagship project. The kind of opportunity people waited a lifetime for. Adrian said nothing that day. He worked as usual. Reviewed simulations. Corrected a junior researcher's assumptions without condescension. Left the lab at the same time he always did. But the atmosphere had shifted. By Friday evening, the lab was nearly empty when Adrian finally spoke about it. Evelyn was seated at a side workstation, running stress tests on a new module, when she sensed him behind her. Not close enough to invade her space. Close enough to be intentional. "They've asked me to go to Germany," he said. She kept her eyes on the screen. "I know." A pause. "I haven't accepted yet." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then resumed typing. "You will?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I haven't decided." Evelyn leaned back slightly, allowing herself to look at him. Adrian's expression was composed, but she recognized the tension beneath it, the calculation, the quiet weight of choice. "This lab would struggle without you," she said carefully. "But it wouldn't stop." "That's not what I asked." Evelyn inhaled slowly. She understood the question. It wasn't about funding or prestige. It wasn't even about loyalty to the lab. Adrian wasn't asking whether the project needed him. He was asking whether she did. He looked at her steadily, waiting. "Give me one reason to stay." The words landed between them, heavy and precise. Evelyn felt the familiar pull of two futures pressing against her chest. In one, she spoke honestly. She admitted what she had begun to recognize but refused to name: the way his presence sharpened her thinking, the way their work felt incomplete without his scrutiny, the way she trusted him in a way she trusted almost no one. In the other, she held the line she had drawn for herself. She chose the second. "This lab would lose someone rare," she said. It was true. It was also not the answer he was asking for. Adrian studied her face, searching for something she did not give. Whatever he found, or didn't, settled into something unreadable. He nodded once. "I see." There was no accusation in his voice, no bitterness, just resolution. The following week passed quickly. Adrian finalized his arrangements. Paperwork was signed. Meetings were scheduled across time zones. The lab buzzed with quiet acknowledgement of his departure, colleagues offering congratulations that carried a trace of envy. Evelyn stayed focused on her work. She told herself this was correct, necessary. She had returned to this life to build something stable, something earned. Emotional dependency had been the fault line that cracked her previous future wide open. She would not repeat that mistake. On Adrian's last night in the lab, she stayed later than usual. The building was nearly empty by the time she finished her final run. She shut down her workstation and turned to find Adrian standing near the exit, jacket over his arm. He had been waiting. They walked out together without speaking. The hallway lights dimmed behind them as they stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut with a soft chime, sealing them into a small, quiet space. For a moment, Evelyn thought about the first elevator she'd stepped into, the one that had ended everything and begun it again. The memory flickered, distant but sharp. The elevator descended smoothly. Adrian broke the silence first. "You were right," he said. "The lab will survive." She nodded. "And you'll do well," she added. "There. I know." The elevator slowed. Evelyn glanced at him, catching something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not regret, but something closer to disappointment, carefully restrained. They reached the ground floor. The doors opened. Adrian stepped out first, then turned back to face her. For a brief moment, it seemed as if he might say something else, something unnecessary, something human. He didn't. "Take care, Evelyn." "You too," she replied. He walked away, his figure swallowed by the glass and light of the lobby. Evelyn remained in the elevator until the doors began to close again. As the car rose back toward the upper floors, she exhaled slowly. Parallel lines, she told herself, were safer. They didn't collide. They didn't destroy each other. But as the elevator climbed, she felt the unmistakable ache of something left unresolved, trailing behind Adrian as he left for another continent. She didn't ask why it hurt. She only knew that, this time, she would have to live with the consequences of choosing restraint over reach. And somewhere between floors, the distance between two parallel paths grew. Quietly, deliberately, wide enough to feel like loss. Adrian Lynn returned to the United States 3 months earlier than anyone expected. The news reached the lab in fragments. An abrupt cancellation of meetings, a withdrawn announcement on a shared calendar, a short email from Dr. Reed that said only, "Adrian will be resuming work domestically." Details to follow. Evelyn read the message twice. She did not look up. She told herself it changed nothing, but the lab felt different almost immediately. Adrian's presence altered the atmosphere the way pressure changed weather. He didn't arrive with explanations or apologies. He took a desk in a temporary office near the lab and resumed work as if the intervening weeks in Berlin had been an extended debug session that failed to converge. Only later did Evelyn learn the truth. The German automotive group had offered resources without autonomy, funding without ownership, collaboration with clauses that transferred intellectual property at the moment of success. Adrian had declined. Instead, he incorporated a small startup in California, quietly, deliberately, bringing with him only a handful of engineers and a conviction sharpened by experience. The lab's research would feed into it indirectly, through partnerships and pilot projects, but the core would remain independent. Victor Hale did not take this well. At first, his resistance was subtle. Evelyn noticed it in the way her name stopped appearing on internal project lists. In meetings she was no longer invited to, her role reduced to support without explanation. When she asked about it, Victor deflected with vague references to seniority and scope. She recognized the pattern instantly, gatekeeping masquerading as process. Then came the formal review. The committee convened on a Thursday afternoon, convened under the banner of resource optimization. Evelyn sat at the long table with a notebook open in front of her, listening as Victor spoke with practiced confidence about team cohesion, experience, thresholds, and risk management. He never mentioned her by name. He didn't need to. When the discussion turned to staffing for a new high-visibility autonomous systems project, one that would involve external partners and significant funding, Victor suggested limiting participation to proven contributors with demonstrated leadership. Evelyn's exclusion was implicit. When Dr. Reed asked for clarification, Victor provided it smoothly. He cited her status as a first-year student, her unconventional background, her promising but untested capabilities. By the time the meeting ended, the decision had already solidified. Evelyn walked out with her expression neutral and her jaw set. She had been here before. In her previous life, this would have been the moment she internalized the verdict. The moment she convinced herself to wait, to be patient, to trust that recognition would arrive eventually. This time, she did not wait. That evening, she went home and opened her laptop, with a different purpose. The National AI and Cybersecurity Challenge had been announced weeks earlier, a competitive event drawing teams from universities, startups, and independent labs across the country. The challenge focused on secure autonomous systems, resilience under attack, fault tolerance, ethical safeguards. In her old timeline, Evelyn had watched the results from afar, telling herself she wasn't ready. Now, she read the rules carefully. The deadline for team registration was 10 days away. She registered as a team lead. Then she began building her team. She didn't recruit loudly. She didn't promise prestige or easy wins. She spoke to people the way she always had, directly, respectfully, with clarity about the work ahead. A second-year systems engineer who had been sidelined for asking too many questions, a cybersecurity graduate student frustrated by theoretical work that never left simulation, a quiet hardware specialist who preferred fixing broken systems to presenting finished ones. They joined not because Evelyn sold them a dream, but because she spoke plainly about effort. They met in borrowed classrooms, empty conference rooms, and once in the corner of a public library. They argued over architecture and threat models. They disagreed sharply and then resolved those disagreements with code. Evelyn led without raising her voice. She delegated clearly. She listened carefully. She took responsibility when decisions failed. Word spread. Victor heard about it a week later. He confronted her in the hallway outside the lab, his expression tight. "You're overstepping," he said. "This competition overlaps with lab interests." "It's open," Evelyn replied, "and independent." "You're still a member of this lab." "Yes. And you're representing it whether you like it or not." Evelyn met his gaze. "Then you should want me to do well." Victor said nothing. Behind them, footsteps approached. Adrian joined them. Without ceremony, his presence immediate and undeniable. "What's the issue?" he asked. Victor's posture shifted. She's diverting attention, building an unsanctioned team. Adrian looked at Evelyn. She did not explain. She did not defend herself. She waited. Adrian turned back to Victor. Is she violating any policy? No, Victor admitted. But then she's free to compete. This could reflect poorly on the lab if she fails. Or well, Adrian replied evenly, if she succeeds. Victor's jaw tightened. You're endorsing this? Adrian shook his head. I'm not endorsing anything. I'm stepping aside. He looked at Evelyn again, his expression unreadable. It's her work. Her risk. It was not protection. It was permission. Victor walked away without another word. Evelyn exhaled slowly. She did not thank Adrian. She did not need to. The competition consumed the next month. Their team worked through nights fueled by cheap coffee and stubborn focus. They tested attack vectors, hardened protocols, rewrote modules that refused to cooperate. When one approach failed, Evelyn cut it without hesitation and redirected effort elsewhere. She was not afraid of losing anymore. She was afraid of wasting time. On the day of submission, they uploaded their final package with minutes to spare. Evelyn closed her laptop and sat back, exhaustion settling into her bones. Whatever happened next, she had chosen this. The results were announced 2 weeks later. Evelyn read the email standing in the lab hallway, her phone held steady in her hand. Her team had advanced to the final round. Not Victor's, hers. The lab reacted in waves: surprise, curiosity, recalibration. Conversation shifted. Eyes followed her when she walked past. Invitations arrived without explanation. Victor retreated behind silence. Adrian observed. He did not approach her immediately. He let the outcomes speak first. When the final presentations concluded and Evelyn's team secured one of the top positions nationally, the recognition was impossible to ignore. Dr. Reed congratulated her publicly. External partners requested meetings. For the first time, Evelyn felt the axis of power tilt, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned leverage. Adrian finally spoke to her late one evening, after the lab had emptied and the city lights flickered on outside the windows. You didn't ask for help, he said. I didn't need it, Evelyn replied. A pause. That's not what I meant. She waited. You didn't need me, Adrian clarified. Evelyn considered the statement carefully. I needed the space to choose. Adrian nodded once. You took it. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't apologize. He respected her. And for Evelyn, that was the cleanest break she had ever made. From her past, from imposed limits, from the quiet permission she once waited for and would never wait for again. The lines between her and Adrian were no longer merely parallel. They had diverged. And in that divergence, she had found her footing. The win did not arrive with fireworks. There was no moment where the room erupted, no dramatic countdown or stunned silence broken by cheers. The announcement came the way real outcomes often did, through an email sent at 7:12 a.m. Pacific Time, subject line neutral, tone restrained. Evelyn read it standing in her kitchen, sunlight cutting across the counter in a pale rectangle. She read it once, then again, slower this time. Her team had taken first place, nationally. She did not move right away. The body needed a moment to catch up with the fact. When it did, the feeling wasn't elation so much as release, like pressure easing after a long, deliberate hold. By noon, the consequences began to ripple outward. Requests for documentation, invitations to present, independent auditors assigned to review the architecture and security framework her team had built. The certification process was rigorous and unglamorous, designed to verify claims rather than celebrate them. Evelyn welcomed it. She had learned the hard way that applause faded faster than proof. The auditors found what she already knew. The system was sound. The threat mitigation protocols held under stress. The fail-safes behaved as designed, degrading gracefully rather than collapsing. The work was not flashy, but it was resilient. That mattered. By the end of the quarter, her technology carried an independent certification. Few student-led projects ever received. It was no longer theoretical. It was viable. That was when the questions started. They came from industry panels, venture groups, and research consortia. Polite inquiries at first, then more pointed ones. Who owned the underlying IP? What partnerships existed? Were there exclusivity clauses already in place? Evelyn answered carefully. There were none. Not anymore. The attempt to quietly absorb the technology into a larger corporate framework, the one Victor Hale had dismissed as coincidence, did not survive scrutiny. Emails surfaced. Proposal drafts. Legal language that spoke plainly once stripped of euphemism. The corporation withdrew before formal accusations could be filed, issuing a statement about strategic realignment. Victor resigned 2 weeks later. The lab adjusted, as systems always did when a flawed component was removed. Through it all, Adrian did not rush in. He watched the process unfold from the edges, advising when asked, stepping back when not. He made introductions when they were useful, declined to speak for Evelyn when she could speak for herself. When the paperwork settled and the dust cleared, the question of next steps became unavoidable. The startup Adrian had founded, small, disciplined, stubbornly independent, had reached a threshold. The technology Evelyn had developed fit its architecture not as an add-on, but as a missing piece. They discussed it the way they discussed everything else, at a whiteboard, with diagrams, with constraints laid out clearly. No one pretended it would be simple. Partnership meant shared risk, shared ownership, the surrender of some control. Evelyn considered the offer overnight. She thought about the old version of herself, the one who had signed agreements she didn't fully understand, grateful just to be included. The one who had been told she was lucky to be there. In the morning, she accepted, with revisions. Adrian read them carefully, then he signed. They became partners in the way that mattered. Not equal in every function, but aligned in direction. Their responsibilities diverged cleanly. Their authority overlapped only where it had to. The work deepened. 2 years passed. The startup grew without spectacle. It didn't chase headlines or inflate projections. It built, tested, revised, and shipped. The team expanded selectively, favoring engineers who asked difficult questions over those who offered easy certainty. Evelyn's role evolved. She moved from hands-on implementation to architectural oversight, guiding systems, rather than assembling them piece by piece. Her instincts sharpened with experience, tempered by the memory of what happened when ambition outran ethics. Adrian remained what he had always been, precise, unyielding, quietly demanding. But the distance between them changed. They no longer worked late into the night because they had to. They did it because they trusted each other to hold the line when things grew complex. Decisions were debated thoroughly and resolved cleanly. Disagreements did not linger. Their partnership extended beyond the office without ceremony. There was no moment where either of them named it. No transition from professional to personal, marked by confession or dramatic realization. They began sharing meals because it was efficient. Began walking together after long days because the silence was comfortable. Eventually, the line between work and life blurred, not into confusion, but into continuity. Evelyn noticed it one evening while reviewing a deployment. Report at Adrian's apartment, the windows open to the city. She paused mid-sentence, struck by the realization that this space, this person, felt integrated into her life rather than adjacent to it. The thought did not alarm her. It steadied her. They did not speak about the past. Not the version of it that involved elevators and erased timelines. not the one Evelyn carried alone, carefully compartmentalized. She had learned that truth, without context, sounded like delusion. But memory had a way of surfacing regardless. It happened on a quiet night in late fall. The company had closed a difficult deal that afternoon, not a major victory, but a necessary one. They ordered takeout they barely ate and sat at opposite ends of the couch, each absorbed in their own review. At some point, Adrian set his tablet aside. "I've been thinking about something," he said. Evelyn looked up, attentive. "I don't believe in fate," he continued, "or repetition, or anything mystical." She nodded. That aligned with everything she knew about him. "But," he said, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the window, "there are moments that feel familiar, as if I've already learned something once and am being asked to learn it again." Evelyn's chest tightened, just slightly. He didn't look at her when he spoke next. "I think I've known you longer than this life." The words landed without drama. They were not a declaration. They were an observation. Evelyn did not respond right away. She felt the weight of the truth pressed gently against the barrier she had built, testing it. She had spent years convincing herself that this knowledge belonged to her alone, that sharing it would destabilize everything she had worked to rebuild. But Adrian was not asking for explanation. He was naming recognition. "I don't know what that means," he added quietly, "only that it feels accurate." Evelyn let out a slow breath. "Maybe," she said at last, choosing her words with care. "Some connections don't reset. They just wait." Adrian turned toward her then, really looking. He did not press. He did not ask her to say more. That was the moment she understood the shape of what they had built. Not a story defined by rescue or sacrifice, not a romance that required one of them to be smaller, but a partnership that could hold complexity without demanding resolution. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent and alive. Inside, two people sat with a truth that did not need to be spoken fully to be real. Evelyn rested her hands on her knees, steady, grounded. For the first time since she stepped into that elevator years ago, she felt something close to certainty. Not about the future, but about herself. And that, she knew now, was the only foundation that lasted. Evelyn woke to the steady rhythm of a monitor. The sound came before thought. Soft, electronic, indifferent. It took several seconds for sensation to gather enough coherence for her to recognize where she was. Light pressed against her eyelids. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and plastic. A hospital. The realization arrived without panic. Her body felt heavy but intact, a dull ache behind her eyes, a tightness in her chest that receded as she breathed. She opened her eyes slowly, adjusting to the white ceiling tiles, the curtain half drawn beside her bed. Present day. The memory of the elevator came back in fragments. The hum, the brief shudder, the sensation of weightlessness that felt like falling and standing still at the same time. Then nothing. A nurse noticed her stirring and checked her vitals with practiced efficiency. Mild concussion. No fractures. Observation overnight. "You're lucky," the nurse said, already moving on. Evelyn didn't respond. Luck had never felt like the right word. When she was alone again, she stared at the ceiling and waited for the afterimage of another life to fade. It didn't. She remembered everything. The lab, the nights of debugging, the quiet alignment with Adrian that had taken years to form, the startup, the win, the slow, deliberate building of something that had not existed before. She waited for it to dissolve, for grief or confusion to crash over her. Instead, what came was a careful, aching stillness. Later that afternoon, she asked for her phone. It was there, functional. No missed calls from another timeline, no signs of collapse. She searched for the company almost without thinking. it existed. The startup's website loaded cleanly, understated as she remembered. Recent updates, new hires, a product roadmap extending into the next year. Her chest tightened. This world had not erased everything, only her place in it. Discharge papers were signed the following morning. Evelyn left the hospital alone, stepping into the gray clarity of San Francisco air that smelled faintly of rain and salt. The city moved around her with practiced indifference. Cars passed. People checked their phones. Life continued. She returned to her apartment and sat on the edge of her bed, grounding herself in the familiar textures. The timeline had reset, but the infrastructure of the world had not. She needed to see him, not to ask, not to explain, just to confirm. The office building stood several blocks away, modern glass catching the light. She hesitated outside longer than she meant to, steadying her breathing before stepping inside. The lobby was quiet, professional, unfamiliar. She asked for Adrian Lynn at the front desk. The receptionist nodded and gestured toward the elevators. Top floor. The ride up felt longer than it should have. When the doors opened, Evelyn stepped into a space that looked almost identical to the one she remembered. Open desks, whiteboards, a subdued hum of focused work. The difference lay in what was missing. She. Adrian stood near the far window, speaking to an engineer with precise gestures. He looked the same, taller than most in the room, composed, distant. When he turned and saw her, something flickered, recognition without context. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was neutral, professional, empty of shared history. Evelyn felt the absence like a hollow. "I was in an accident," she said. The words felt insufficient, but they were all she allowed herself. "I wanted to check something." Adrian studied her for a moment longer than politeness required. Then he nodded. "I'm glad you're all right," he said. "If you need assistance, our operations team—" "That's fine," she interrupted gently. "I just needed to know." "Know what?" She didn't say. She didn't ask if he remembered nights that had never happened here. Didn't ask if he had ever looked at her the way he had in another life. She thanked him, turned to leave. Adrian watched her go, a faint crease forming between his brows, as if something unresolved had passed through the room without permission. The elevator doors slid shut. Evelyn exhaled slowly as the car descended. This was the cost. Not loss exactly. Not erasure, but separation. Days passed. Evelyn returned to work, to routines that felt both familiar and wrong. She moved through the city with the quiet awareness of someone carrying a truth that could not be spoken. She told no one. At night, she dreamed of systems converging, of paths that ran close enough to feel inevitable but never touched. She woke with her heart steady, resolved to live in this world as it was, not as she wished it to be. She would not interfere. She would not chase. Then, one evening, she found herself back in the same building, late, finishing a meeting that ran longer than expected. The office floors were nearly empty, the city outside dark and scattered with light. She stepped into the elevator alone. The doors closed. The car began its descent. Halfway down, it shuddered. Not violently, just enough to be noticeable, a brief tremor that made the lights flicker and the floor hum. Evelyn's breath caught. The sensation was too familiar. The elevator slowed, then resumed its movement, systems correcting. But the moment had already passed through her like an echo. The doors opened on the next floor. Adrian stepped in. He looked tired. His jacket was draped over one arm, his tie loosened. He nodded in polite acknowledgement and turned to face forward. The doors closed again. They stood in silence as the car moved. Then it happened. Another small vibration, barely perceptible. The kind that meant nothing. Except that Adrian's hand moved. It was instinctive. unthinking. His fingers reached out and closed around Evelyn's wrist, firm but not forceful, grounding. The gesture lasted less than a second before awareness caught up. Adrian froze. So did she. He looked down at their hands, then up at her face. Something shifted in his expression. Confusion, recognition, the faintest trace of something that felt like memory without origin. Evelyn didn't pull away. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The elevator continued its descent, smooth now, untroubled. When the doors opened at the lobby, Adrian released her hand slowly, as if unsure which moment required apology. He began, then stopped. Evelyn met his gaze. There was no accusation in her eyes, no demand, only quiet understanding. "It's all right," she said softly. He nodded, unsettled. They stepped out into the lobby together, then parted in different directions without another word. Evelyn walked into the night air and felt something inside her loosen. Not everything survived time, but some things did not belong to any single life. Some connections, she understood now, were not bound by continuity or proof. They existed beneath awareness, surfacing only when the world trembled just enough to let them through. She did not look back. She didn't need to. The city moved on around her, alive and indifferent, and Evelyn stepped forward with it, carrying a certainty that required no explanation. Some connections survived time, and this one, she knew, had found its way home.